Here's a question from D. Guy. I have a friend who is Jewish but does not practice Judaism. This friend says there is no mention of heaven or hell in the Torah. I haven't had time to research his claim. Therefore, he doesn't believe there is an afterlife. How would you respond if only using the Torah?
Well, it's difficult to respond to a challenge like that. Okay, what if I said there is no heaven or hell mentioned in John chapter 6? Maybe that's not a good source, but the point is I'm just restricting it. So how can you argue for heaven or hell if it's not mentioned in John chapter 6? Well, that may not be the purpose of John 6. It's actually John 6 does talk about eternal life, so it's not a good characterization, but you know what I'm talking about, what I'm referring to. If you say, I'm limiting it to these scriptures, okay, argue for something even though it's not mentioned in this. Well, that's an artificial restraint. Okay, the Pentateuch was meant to accomplish a particular thing. By the way, just saying, the word love doesn't even occur until Deuteronomy. Okay, Deuteronomy is the last book of the Pentateuch. What if I said, God's love is not even mentioned in the first 4 books of the Pentateuch? So, how can you say God's loving when in the first 4 books it's not there? How do you argue for God's love? Well, you can't from those first 4 books where it's not mentioned. Okay? But that's because those books had a different purpose. They are not meant to describe eschatology. All right. Now, there is eschatology, that is, end things. How does this all work out? Heaven and hell, final resurrection, that kind of stuff, in other parts of the Scripture. You see it in Job, which, by the way, arguably, Job is the earliest book penned, and where Job says, without my flesh, I shall see God. Okay? And you see it in Daniel, making reference to things that are going to happen in the future, and an ultimate resurrection. I think it's Daniel 12, talks about a resurrection. But you don't see these more graphic descriptions of heaven or hell. You see descriptions of God's punishment, but most of God's punishment depicted in the Old Testament is characterized by physical descriptions of what happens to the physical body. Now, Tim Barnett and I talked about this when we wrote the series called Hell Interrupted, a Solid Ground series, 1, 2, and 3, to answer the challenges that many Christians have raised against the idea of eternal torment. And they were arguing, look, things are just destroyed. They're gone. There's smoke rising to heaven kind of thing, so they're gone. And my point with regards to the Old Testament passages was that the focus was on what could visibly be seen. But the final word is the last word, and we get the final word in the New Testament, the Gospels with Jesus, and the book of Revelation. And that adds information that we didn't have early on. There is clearly this idea of progressive revelation in Scripture, even in the Pentateuch. You start out with some basic stuff in Genesis, and then more is added. Progressive revelation. So you get more details in Exodus and Leviticus regarding how God works out the promise he made to Abraham in Genesis 12 to build a nation, because a nation requires not only a group of people, but also a government that provides content and cohesiveness to that group. That comes in Exodus and Leviticus. All right? So that's later. It's progressive revelation. As time goes on, God reveals more of what is necessary. So therefore, it's not a failure because certain things that are part of the whole story are not mentioned in the beginning of the story. Mm-hmm. That's just a wrong way to approach it. Wait a minute. How can you say the Ten Commandments? I don't see the Ten Commandments anywhere in the book of Genesis. Show me the Ten Commandments in Genesis. If you can't show me the Ten Commandments in Genesis, then that's not significant or important. Well, Genesis is the book of beginnings. And so you have the beginning of the world, you have the beginning of mankind, you have the beginning of the problem, and you have the beginning of the solution. which is God's call of Abraham and the promise made there, and how that works out. It's not intended for that. So I think that the question is misplaced. And to demand that one section deliver all of these goods, I think is inappropriate. Does God have to mention heaven and hell in the Pentateuch? No, the Pentateuch was for a different purpose. It was laying the foundation for the theocracy and also God's plan for rescuing the world. By the way, well, I was just going to say, if God has got a plan to rescue the world, that means there is a cost if it's not rescued, or some are not rescued. Okay? There's a price to pay. So the rescue means something, and it is unfortunate that Jewish people who are acknowledging the Pentateuch as central, which it is, don't look at the other books that bear witness to some of these other things. Okay, it's curious. Now I'm thinking about it. Our questioner's friend, who is not a practicing Jew, is faulting Christian theology because it's not in the Pentateuch. Does he really care what's in the Pentateuch? If heaven and hell were in the Pentateuch, would that make a difference for him? It doesn't sound like it.
No, because it says he wasn't practicing.
It's a goofy. Yeah, well, okay, there you go. So, what would it, look at all of in the Pentateuch, you have the whole sacrificial system, right? The sacrificial system is to secure forgiveness for the people. If the people weren't forgiven, what would be the consequence? Well, it would have to be something, or else there's no point in forgiving them. And certainly the consequence isn't in this life.
In that instance, I think he could argue that it was the curses. So the Mosaic law had the blessings and the curses. If they weren't forgiven, then they would receive the curses for their nation. So maybe he could answer that way. But one thing I wanted to expand on that you mentioned, Greg, the idea that God was doing something at the beginning, even in just the revelation as he's revealing things, he was changing a whole worldview. He was shaping and creating a whole worldview. And what he did was he did that through history. He did that through physical things to later on illustrate spiritual things. So, for example, the Exodus, rescue from slavery, rescue from sin. Later on, they used that to illustrate rescuing from sin. There was the temple, which had all these physical things that you do that later on you find out in Hebrews how all these things represented Christ, and it was preparing people to see the spiritual aspects of what was going on. And the same thing happened with judgment. Greg, you mentioned this part. If you go and you look, I think 2 Peter and maybe even Jude talks about how the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah is an illustration for us of what will happen in the afterlife, God's judgment. Mm-hmm. So just because God hadn't explained all that yet, that wasn't the way he was operating. He was creating these ideas in their culture to shape their worldview so that the spiritual ideas would make sense. And he used the physical things in history to make sure we understood the spiritual things.
Yeah.
Now, there's one other thing, Greg, that occurred to me, because this is exactly the argument that was going on between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, whether or not there was a resurrection. This is why they had the big fight when Paul says, "Oh, I'm here defending the resurrection," and there was a huge fight. Mm-hmm. But it occurred to me that somebody asked Jesus this very question, and in Luke 20, they come to him and they say, well, if a man has a wife and then the man dies and she takes the next husband and then he dies and then he goes on. And then he says, which one will be her husband in the afterlife? Because they're trying to make the afterlife look silly.
Right. In the resurrection.
In the resurrection,
I think, is the way they refer to it. So the resurrection is the event that leads to the afterlife. So they believed in the afterlife. These legalistic Torah observant Jews.
The Sadducees,
Or at least what the Pharisees did, not the Sadducees.
So the Sadducees are asking him this question to show him that there is no afterlife. So it says they say that there is no resurrection, and that's why they were trying to make it look foolish. And here was Jesus' response, because here is a response you can give. He says, "But that the dead are raised, even Moses showed in the passage about the burning bush, where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. Now he is not the God of the dead, but of the living." So
excellent.
That was Jesus' response. So that's one answer you
That's
could give.
right. In other words, those who had died relative to Moses, they were in the past, they were dead and gone, are still alive in themselves, not in God's memory, but in themselves at that temporal moment. I actually think this is a good argument for the temporality of God, at least since the creation, because those individuals he cites are alive to God in the now, which is what makes the argument for the resurrection work. And if there is no now for God, which would be the case if he was atemporal, outside of time, then the argument wouldn't work. That's another issue, and you're thinking, "Hey, wait a minute, I never." But but the point there is that those individuals who were dead to Moses are actually alive to God in the moment. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Another point, too, is Jesus makes a theological argument based on the Old Testament scriptures and the tense of a word. In other words, he took these verses seriously as being God-breathed, even down to the tense of the verb, because that's what his argument hinges on.
Mm-hmm. It's just so interesting to me, Greg, that these arguments that were going on in Jesus' day among the Jews are still going on today in what they accept as, because to your earlier point, the Pharisees accepted all of the writings, and that's why they did believe in a resurrection, because clearly it was in the Old Testament. It wasn't just in the New Testament. And it was the Sadducees who only accepted the Pentateuch, who were the ones who rejected the idea of the resurrection. Still going on today, Greg. Still, human beings are still human beings and still having the same questions, and it makes it an interesting place.
It does.